Brand Elverston, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for making time to visit with us. This is our third annual edition, if you will, of the Winning with Walmart Solutions Summit. We're so excited to have you here today talking about asset protection. If you would, take as long as you need to introduce yourself and to talk about the path that led you to Walmart.
It's kind of an interesting story. I uh, proudly graduated from the University of Alabama in December of '84 and was immediately ushered off to active duty as an artillery officer. Spent 12 years on active duty total. And when I was at my last duty station in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, I was an instructor. So, which means no troop assignments, no alerts, no, deployments, all of that uh, stuff that I had experienced all my prior years. And so I started seeing a little bit of the civilian world, if you will. And it sounds kind of strange for a veteran will get it, but most civilians are like, what are you talking about? But it was the first exposure, if you will, really about there are other things I can do. And when I started looking at that, I'm like, you know what? If I do decide to get out, I'm going to need something a bit more current than an 11-year-old at the time, 11-year-old undergraduate degree. And so I decided to get an MBA while I was teaching at Fort Sill, so night school and all that uh, fun stuff. And while in the MBA course, that's when the blinders really came off. And because my fellow students were CEOs, CFOs, accountants, finance guys, strategy, merchandise, all these things that were completely foreign to me. And I loved it. It was hard because I had no business undergrad degree. So you can imagine going from, the basics to graduate level finance, accounting, et cetera. So it was tough. But it was then that it really crystallized for me that I can do more. And I had had the most exhilarating and demanding job any Army officer will ever have, which is command. So I was very fortunate. I commanded 2 artillery units in Germany in the early '90s. So I knew that exhilaration was over. And the next stop would likely be in the basement of the Pentagon, doing somebody's PowerPoints or pouring coffee. So I decided to make a jump. And there was this company that at the time, and that was 1995, Walmart. And at the time, I could have probably guessed I might have been in one and didn't really know it. But it wasn't the beast it is today. The Supercenter division, as it was called back then, was just getting its legs from 1988. So about 5 years in, that was clearly going to be the accelerator and the new growth engine for Walmart. So we did a lot of business case studies in the MBA program on this company called Walmart. So like any other veteran, I started sprinkling out resumes. That was before the internet and all that. So you actually had to get periodicals and read job descriptions that I had no clue what the heck it meant, but I applied anyway. Long story short, Walmart was one of the 4 or 5 companies that asked for in-person interviews. And interestingly wound up, I had applied for logistics because, as every veteran knows, it's very difficult to understand the life you just came from and how does that translate. And the closest thing I could come up with was logistics. So I sent my resume to Walmart Logistics. Next thing I know, when I'm teaching a class at Fort Sill, the sergeant came in, slipped me a note, said, "Hey, this guy from Walmart just called." I'm like, okay. So finished the class, got back on the phone with this guy from Walmart. He's like, "Hey, Keith Obley," and a lot of people listening to this will know Keith. He said, "Hey, Keith Obley, Walmart, I want to talk to you about a position in security." And I was 2 seconds from hanging the phone up. I thought, you got to be kidding me. Because in my mind, mall cop, I'm like, dude, I didn't go to undergrad and grad and 12 years active duty and all these things that at the time, I thought, you know what, that's worth something. And it is. But he said these words: "Before you hang up, let me explain what that means." Because he is an Air Force veteran. So he understood where my head immediately went. Anyway, long story short, got hired at Walmart, wound up in the asset protection division. Back then, it was called loss prevention. And maybe we'll talk about that transition later. But that's where I started because it was my undergrad degree that he said really raised a flag for them and made them pursue me. And I'm like, well, yeah, that would have been nice to know before I spent 30 grand on an MBA. Uh, so anyway, that's kind of how I wound up at Walmart.
In the context of asset protection and risk mitigation, what were some of your key responsibilities during your entire tenure at Walmart?
It changed, just like the mission of the asset protection division changed. So in the mid 90s, it was very much malicious intent, apprehensions, investigations, and safety. I was very fortunate. My first assignment with Walmart was upstate New York in the Supercenter division. So we had four. And at the time, the leadership layers in the field were by division. So you had the groups of asset protection and ops that did nothing but super centers. Then you had a completely complementary, but the same layer just for the regular stores. And I made the right decision. I opted for super centers and I had a market manager who was about as fluent in store ops as anybody I encountered in my 20 odd years at Walmart. And it was then that he took me under his wing and showed me, look, yes, you can work investigations. You have to do your core job, but there's so much more to the retail operation and the opportunities for loss in process and receiving and logistics, et cetera. And it was that spark really from him that made me understand very early on it ain't all theft. And that wasn't very popular in 1995, 96, and 97 back then. Um, but it gave me a more comprehensive view, if you will, or a broader lens to look at all risk associated with a store, not just running down shoplifters. And that resulted in me being asked to interview and getting promoted 11 months with a company to Bentonville. So I was promoted down and to create a new position the asset protection division was creating back then, merchandise, what was it called? Merchandise systems coordinator. And it was the liaison from the asset protection group to the merchants primarily, but also systems to look at all the data and how can we turn that into predictors or indicators of loss. And that's where it started. That was April of 96 when I landed at the home office.
You've been gone from the company for some time now, and so talk a little bit about your role as an advisor now to the retail industry.
Yeah, that I retired in March of 17, so it's coming up on 8 years, believe it or not. And I always felt like there was and I'm going to use the euphemism, if you will, of a boat anchor in the sand. The retail asset protection industry to this day struggles with innovation. And there's some retailers that are doing really well with it. Joe Cole at Macy's with RFID shrink visibility. So there's some bright spots. But largely the industry is very legacy laden when it comes to solutions to addressing all risks. And that was something that I was kind of the oddball out for a lot of years. And then as the division and Walmart began to change in the mid 2000s under different leadership, we began to understand a broader view of risk. So it was under JP Suarez, who was our VP at the time. That was probably around 05, 06. He allowed me to play in the sandbox that was kind of forbidden before, which is going to DARPA, going to Lockheed Martin, all these non-traditional providers that when I would return from the trips, my immediate boss was scratching his head like, what are you doing? What do they have to do with X? And I continued to do that. You know, obviously you got to do your day job, but I knew there had to be something more on the table. We can't continue. It can't be all there is to it, or just lock it up and have a retired cop at the door. And so I pushed as hard as I could while I was on the clock, but I had responsibilities to Walmart, and that was priority. Uh, and then when I decided to retire in March of 17, the handcuffs were off, and I could unleash this uh, nirvana where I am today and being able to freely explore and probe and recruit and push retail trade groups. In this case, now RELA. I'm on the advisory board at RELA. Um, for more innovation because the technology, as many know, has changed dramatically. And there is a lot of money on the table that if we just push the bookends out on the value prop in existing and scalable technologies, we can do a huge solve for asset protection, but it's still a challenge. We're still not there yet uniformly.
Bringing it back to Walmart, how would you describe a supplier's ownership and obligations today with respect to asset protection?
Their obligation is, and this is, I always consult potential clients or anybody that I'm having a conversation with, be that at a trade show, that look, the secret sauce today is if your singular offering is I can impact theft, you just really hampered your ability to penetrate anybody that's looking outside of that window. So if I'm vendor X and I say, look, if you buy this widget and put it on DVDs or video games or whatever, it'll curb theft. Great. There's probably a market for that somewhere. But I always push them that you've got to start first with a value prop that matters to sales in a genuine sense, not what we used to say about EAS back in the day, because that was kind of a hollow pitch. But a true saying, look, I have an AI vendor. Yeah, sure, they can detect X, but they also can do out of stocks. I mean, there's more we can do with this technology. So it's pushing the bookends out and understanding the true innovators from the ones that are, and I'm not going to be negative about it, but they're just looking for a sale. Here's my widget. How many do you want? Sign here. I'm not in that space, even though there's a space for that. So those providers that want to be successful have to have a broader vision. They have to understand the loss component is part of their value prop. Um, and if so, and if that's their authentic solution proposition, the likelihood of success is far greater than it was years ago with buy my widget.
How is the burden shared between Walmart and their suppliers with respect to loss?
Um, so if you, th- the viewfinder that providers and understandably are trying to approach are the external factors contributing to loss. So if I'm uh, pick a vendor X, and I have solution Y, it's probably and understandably going to be designed to impact the components that are external to loss. Because they don't have any ownership in getting your PI, your perpetual inventory right, or your on hands, or making sure that what left the CPG physical quantity matches what's on the PO. That's really not their wheelhouse, but it can be, particularly in more progressive technologies like AI. Um, Tons of hype on that. I get it, but it has real value when it's dialed into specific use cases, just like the battles, 25, 30 years with RFID. That was the late 90s when we were at the Auto ID Center at MIT in the basement with Dr. Sarma. Um, and here we are today, and it's still a struggle to see scale. And there's still retailers out there testing to see if it works. And I'm like, holy cow, how many years do we test before we understand the value prop like Joe Call is doing at Macy's? So I understand that, that a provider can only affect so much, but it's really incumbent to your question. It's really incumbent upon the retailer to understand themselves what it is they're trying to address. So put my blue badge back on. Vendor comes in, I have this and I can solve this. Two ways that can go. I can say, great, I'm only going to put you in the box that says you're going to, curb this much theft. Or I can look at my total loss risk, like Dr. Adrian Beck has talked about for years now, total loss, and see how that solution can impact the upstream. And if it's AI or something a bit more progressive, it's an easier sell. But if it's a gadget, you're pretty much in the theft box, and that's all it's ever going to be. So it's two-sided. The retailer should challenge themselves on the bigger, broader problem. And then the provider should be able to entertain playing in that space to help me solve. I'm going to use out of stocks because that's a hot button, or help in the inventory management that is clearly a struggle for Target, Kohl's. I mean, you've seen as much as I've seen. Those that can't control inventory can't control operations, and they can't control the shrink, and they're all hand in hand. So it's way different than it was in '95 when I was across the table from a provider and it was purely transactional.
As you well know, shoplifting and organized crime get most of the headlines, but shrinkage goes far beyond stolen goods. And you alluded a
Yeah.
moment ago to total shrink. So please explain the components of total shrink and which parts are more and less controllable.
All of them are controllable to a degree. Um, Total retail loss, in its most academic definition, is every opportunity from A to Z for loss. And that includes anything you can quantify from the a little bit more opaque of reputational risk. If we do program X, what could that cost us reputationally? But in a more tactical sense, that opportunity for total retail loss begins the very second Walmart transmits a PO to Procter and Gamble. It starts there. And in my 22 years, there wasn't a lot of attention given to anything. The 80% of the attention was given to the four walls of the store. And when you push back on logistics, so wait a minute, we probably have opportunity in misships or errors or whatever. No, not here. We are airtight in logistics. So understanding that that total retail loss starts when that PO, when they hit transmit, in an oversimplification to P&G or Magnavox, so whoever, and understanding that there are imperfections that will be introduced in that process at some point, no matter how automated. Think about everything. Here's a good example: COVID. And we know COVID stress tested every facet of human existence uh, to varying degrees. And one huge one for retail was supply chain and inventory management. So when COVID hit, and I'm going to do the Reader's Digest version, but it was a massive disruption to inventory management. So several retailers were double ordering, knowing they were only going to get half. They were ordering ahead, knowing the lead times were now, from a month to now 3 months, and it was all over the place. And what we begin to see is, while shrink has gone up significantly year over year in most retailers from say 18, 17, 18, and then really accelerated during COVID, when the inventory settles and we get inventory back under control, so too does shrink, because there's a huge contribution from inventory mismanagement that feeds directly to shrink. So, quick example: if you inventory at retail and you accept, when doing price changes, you accept what the system says you physically have versus physically counting it, to whatever degree your physical inventory does not match your system, that is your component of retail shrink, because you're not making the correct financial adjustments, be that overstated or understated. It's loss. You don't know that. So the entire spectrum, total retail loss. So it's throwaways, it's out of dates, it's failing to record those. I know that's big in grocery, but since Walmart's business is north of 51% grocery, it's becoming more of a concern on how do you process, the date coded bananas, if you will, or out of date meat or chicken, or rotating that stock and taking the progressive markdowns so the customer can buy it at a reduced price before it's out of date completely. Um, and that's still a battle. Total retail loss. In fact, years ago when Adrian Dr. Beck came to Walmart, and we were working on mobile scan and go. And he was doing a research paper on global risk associated with non-traditional tender, self-checkout, mobile scan and go, whatever. And I remember him talking about total retail loss. And I thought, man, this guy's clueless. You know, first of all, and we're friends to this day, so I laugh about saying it. I'm like, first of all, you're an academic. You've never lived in my shoes. So thank you for your contribution, but you're out of touch. And then, you grow, you kind of learn the broader business and you get more seasoned and more experience. And he was absolutely right. But it's still a minority out there that truly values the risks associated with total retail loss versus what's that shrink number I get at the end of every inventory in a store, and then making the false assumption that, as the NRF study used to say, as you know, it didn't come out this year, 67 cents of every shrink dollar is theft, which I've never subscribed to since I walked into Walmart's home office the first time in 95. That's baloney. I don't buy it. There's so much more to it. And the ones that truly understand total retail loss will be far more effective in addressing the issue than if they continue to think, well, it's a simple matter of locking up shoplifters. That's all there is to it.
You spent a lot of time in the States and abroad evaluating new and non-traditional technologies and solutions. And uh, what technologies has Walmart introduced in recent years to address shrinkage that you're the most excited about? What's working and what problems remain unsolved?
Yeah. Obviously, I don't work there anymore, so I don't have the whiteboard and the project list. But um, one that I think is very interesting, and we started it when I was there, and this is public, so this isn't anything Walmart legal needs to raise an antenna on. But Lowe's is doing it, and it's called point of sale activation, and it's a technology we worked on probably 2012 collaboratively with other retailers and the Loss Prevention Research Council. And it's essentially a one-time use code on any electronic item where you have middleware, firmware, that when Matt buys, let's call it, you buy, I don't know, a Samsung phone, smartphone, and you power it up, you will get an unlock code on the receipt that you have to key in the first time. So you get a blue screen, enter purchase code, whatever it says. You enter that, you're unlocked, you're golden. You only get that code if you have an effective tender. So if you steal it, you're never going to be able to use that device. And it's called point of sale activation. And it's Lowe's created their own internal component, and it was big splash in the media. Attaboy to them for doing that. So while we were leading it, things kind of move slow in retail, as many of us know. And I think Lowe's, beat us to the market. Another technology is what is often called in the industry trusted customer. So if I'm, for example, going to Target or any retailer and I'm in their proprietary app, Walmart.com, Target.com, Best Buy, whatever, my anonymity is gone. In other words, something that's very valuable to a thief, I don't want you to know who I am. But when I sign into bestbuy.com, my anonymity's gone. They know me. I got my name, address, everything they required me to put in. But what it allows us to be able to do is unlock showcases via Bluetooth. That I am now a trusted customer. I can unlock that showcase. Sure, you can steal, but I know who you are. And smart retailers would synchronize opening of a case with video capture to be able to match the visual to the data, and being able to understand, okay, this is what happened. Yep, sure, that person opened that showcase, but didn't close it. And right behind him, so he obviously opened it for somebody else. Somebody else came by and unloaded the case. So again, a very slow adoption, glacially slow. But those are two that are more publicly discussed in the industry. Um, and then, of course, artificial intelligence and the capabilities of intelligent video and being able to detect real time instances. A client, Everseen, all of my listeners know Everseen. They are the gold standard in detecting malicious intent behaviors. Well, any kind of incorrect behaviors at self checkout. In time for me as a pay station attendant to do something about it. And that's critical in the self checkout space, because as we see in the media, just about every retailer is rethinking self checkout penetration. Some have abandoned completely, some are pulling the reins in a little bit, but most are making significant retreats, which, in the absence of having ever seen, for example, on top of those self checkouts, I agree with them. If you're not going to, you know, slide into home plate, you're going to get 5 feet short and expect to get results. That's a decision you made, and it's probably not a good one.
Yeah.
So
Let's talk.
they're doing some smart things, but again, the pace of retail innovation is what has frustrated me from 1995 to this day.
Let's talk a little bit about the future with greater traceability at the product, at the item level, with better and better use of artificial intelligence. How would you
Mhm.
expect ownership and obligations to shift in the years ahead with respect to asset protection, risk mitigation at Walmart? My From a layman's perspective, let's just talk in terms of theft. If an item is stolen, that's 100% on the retailer today,
Mhm.
correct? So with greater traceability and the use of all this technology, do you see the ownership and obligation, the responsibility, the pain and suffering, if you will, shifting at all over to the supplier?
I don't. Um, and let me rewind all the way back to when we made the corporate decision at Walmart to go chain with EAS, and that was the late 90s. Very different company back then. EAS was seen as the, winning technology, if you will. And beyond EAS, all we had was, and we thought we were being pretty advanced, was telling the supplier, you got to use 16 gauge heat sealed plastic if you did clam packs, and making the packaging harder to defeat, which did absolutely nothing for organized retail crime because they're taking everything. We were trying to address the one offs when Matt comes in and pops open the case of the power drill. uh, we tried to beef up the packaging to make that harder. So I don't see it. We got huge pushback back in the day, and that was fairly public with the Consumer Product Manufacturers Association, CPMA. And the sole reason that was put together was to stop EAS source tagging. That was the sole purpose. And it was obviously, who was it back then? It was Procter and Gamble, Gillette, J&J, and Kodak were the four main players. Uh, Anyway, we had different leadership back then, and they were ugly meetings back then, not exactly PC, and there was an agreement you will source tag. Um, and you can fill in the blanks on who were the key players at the table who mandated that. But that was really the first time that we operationally mandated to providers, you own some of this shrink risk. And it was not a good relationship. And Mike Green talks about it on some of his podcasts about the history of the P&G relationship with Walmart. I read about it in Sam's book before I interviewed, and it's much better. It's light years ahead of where it was today. Much more collaborative. We've grown past that. But to say suppliers are ready to stand up and say, okay, I own some of this shrink risk beyond the EAS source tagging, and that is necessarily going to migrate to RFID source tagging. Um, I don't see a huge play in a provider, Apple, for example, saying, okay, if you can tell me your shrink rate is 2% on Apple products across the chain, we'll meet you in the middle and give you a rebate of 1%, or we'll give it back to you in margin or something. I don't see that to this day. I really don't. I'd like to be wrong, but I don't see it.
In what ways are you seeing best-in-class Walmart suppliers operating to mitigate shrink and loss, and where do you feel like others are falling behind?
Yeah, the clear differentiator is the one trick ponies versus the ones that truly want to solve. And while we've made progress in that area, I'll name some great examples, and it's nothing I haven't put out on LinkedIn. My top picks every year I do in April-ish after I get back from my Europe trip. Um, the providers that understand the broader risk and they can solve for more than just the guy running out the door with a video game, that's the winning formula. And but there's a place for both. And so as we saw during COVID, on social media, the mischaracterization fanned by the flames of video of the smash and grabs and the gangbangers. And yeah, that happens, but it always happened. What's different now is the degree of violence. So the threat of if you attempt to stop that gang running out of Macy's or Nordstrom's, whatever it was, um, you're putting your life on the line. And no sane retailer is ever going to expect their associates or their employees to do that. Screw it. Let them have, $20,000 in handbags or whatever. Who cares? So there's always going to be a place for the what I call the gadgetry, the mechanical, unintelligent, like a EAS hard tag on a pair of $200 blue jeans or a Gucci bag or whatever. There'll be a place for that. My frustration or disappointment, I guess, is that I would have thought that after these stratospheric levels of retail shrink that were mentioned on just about every earnings call up until about 2 quarters ago, maybe three, every retailer from Dick's Sporting Goods saying the reason I missed street expectations was theft, which I didn't buy for a minute, all the way to where Doug McMillan was on NSNBC, CNBC, Power Lunch, something. And they asked him, they put him in a corner on shrink. And, Doug, he's like, well, yeah, it's a problem. It's worse than we want it to be. Uh, but we're managing it, was his message. He's got 4,700 US stores. So if he closes 20, as you heard me on CNBC Power Lunch when the reporter tried to counter me, I'm like, okay, it's 20 stores. I got 4,700. This is not going to be
Not
a
material.
catastrophe. It's like
Yeah.
doing business. So you got the gadget guys that unfortunately are still going to have a place. And I put EAS in that box, unintelligent devices, liquor locks, lock and show cases, spider wrap, acrylic cases, restrictive shelves, all that stuff. It's easy. It doesn't require systems integration, which is a huge challenge when you bring a provider into retail. And then you've got the more progressive, the artificial intelligence, the software as a solution, sit on top of your cameras. I can tell you when Matt breaks off the shelf of pressed white strips. I can do a real time alert. I can tell you when you have an out of stock. Uh, those kinds of things are really different. And to my earlier point, I would have hoped we reached what I've coined as the Sputnik moment, that this would have been retail's pause to say, all right, enough. Shrink is up 2x. It's billions or hundreds of millions. We can't keep doing what we're doing, i.e., off duty law enforcement at the door with a taser and a lock and showcase. We were doing that before you and I were born, Matt. Something's got to give. And I think the pressure that's being put on retailers today is the reduced staffing model because of COVID and, finance guys figured out I don't need all those staffing hours, always want to save money. Probably never going to go back to pre-COVID staffing levels. And so all of those mechanical manual processes that we struggled with execution before are simply not getting done, which means when Matt comes in to buy anything in Walgreens, for example, it's all locked up. Are you going to wait or are you going to go to Amazon.com and say, dude, I can have this on the way to my house before I walk out of the store? We haven't reached that Sputnik moment I was hoping we would have. A few bright spots here and there, buddy, but as far as the industry goes, it's still a challenge.
Yeah. It used to be that we could say retail is a simple business and we're the ones that make it complicated, but I don't know that that's true anymore. There's so many moving parts and the size and scale, and it really is amazing that Walmart does as good a job as they do.
Mhm.
An exciting time to be students of the industry and have an opportunity to work alongside such smart people. Brand, it's always great catching up. Thank you so much for making a few minutes to visit with us as we kick off our Winning with Walmart Summit, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate the time. Have a good day.